October 1942. Stalingrad. The city was no longer a place for human beings. It was a jagged, toothless mouth of broken brick and twisted iron. The air didn't smell like oxygen. It smelled of pulverized stone, cold fat, and the metallic tang of dried blood. In the heart of the Red October factory district, there was a pile of rubble that used to be a foreman's office. To any German patrol passing by, it looked like 1,000 other ruins. But inside that pile, beneath 2 layers of charred floorboards and a dusting of gray ash, lay Nikolai. Nikolai was not a man. He was a rifle with a heartbeat. He had been lying there for 48 hours. He had not stood up. He had not sat up. He had moved only his fingers, periodically, to ensure the blood didn't freeze in his joints. His world was exactly 4 inches wide, the diameter of the hole he had cleared through the bricks. Through his Mosin-Nagant's 3.5 XPU scope, the world was a circle of gray. The target. The word from intelligence was specific. General von Kessler was coming. Von Kessler was not like the other Prussian officers. He was a strategist, a man who had mastered the art of urban encirclement. He was the brain behind the German advance into the factory district. If the brain died, the body of the Sixth Army would stumble. But von Kessler was a ghost. He never stood near windows. He never wore his medals in the field. He moved through the trenches like a shadow. "He is a smoker," the commissar had whispered to Nikolai before he vanished into the ruins. "He is disciplined, but every man has a hunger. Watch for the flame." Day 1, the silence. The first 24 hours were a test of the soul. A German squad moved into the building across the street, a shattered apartment complex they called the Beehive. Nikolai watched them through his scope. He saw a young soldier, barely 18, eating a piece of gray bread. He saw another cleaning his boots. Nikolai's finger sat lightly on the trigger. He could have killed them all. But he was a hunter of kings, not pawns. To fire now would be to scream his location to every mortar team in the sector. He waited. Rain began to fall. A cold, greasy drizzle that turned the ash into slush. It soaked through his padded Telegrika jacket. He didn't shiver. Shivering moves the barrel. Instead, he slowed his breathing, a technique he learned hunting wolves in the Ural Mountains. He imagined his blood turning to ice, moving slow and thick, keeping him perfectly still. Day 2, the trap. By the second day, the hunger began to claw at his stomach. He had a small piece of dried meat in his pocket, but to reach for it meant movement. Movement meant friction. Friction could be seen. Suddenly, movement in the Beehive. A German officer emerged onto a balcony. He was wearing a high-collared greatcoat. He stood boldly, looking out over the Soviet lines with binoculars. Nikolai's eye pressed against the scope. Is it him? The man's posture was arrogant. He stood for a full minute. It was a perfect shot. A gift. But Nikolai's gut twisted. He looked at the shadows behind the officer. There, in the darkness of the room, he saw the faint glint of glass. Another scope. A decoy. Nikolai hissed in his mind. The Germans were hunting him too. They had put a junior officer in a general's coat to draw the sniper's fire. If Nikolai pulled the trigger, a German countersniper would see his muzzle flash and put a bullet through his eye before Nikolai could even bolt the next round. He let the officer live. He stayed in the ash. Day 3, the breaking point. The third day brought the fog. A thick, yellow mist that rolled off the Volga River. Nikolai's vision was failing. His eyes were bloodshot and burning from the constant strain of the lens. His legs were numb. He wasn't sure if he could walk if he had to. At 1400 hours, the German artillery began a massive bombardment of the Soviet positions behind him. The ground heaved. Dust fell from the ceiling of his burrow, coating his rifle. He didn't blink. Then he saw the car. A Staff Horch 901 pulled up behind the Beehive. 4 soldiers scrambled out, forming a perimeter. 2 officers followed. One of them was short, stout, and moved with a heavy, confident limp. He didn't wear a general's hat, just a simple field cap. He didn't go to the balcony. He stayed in the shadows of the ground floor, talking to a colonel. Nikolai adjusted his range. 300 meters. The wind was blowing left to right at 5 knots. The short man stepped back into the deepest shadows of a ruined kitchen. He was almost invisible. Nikolai could only see the silhouette of his head. Then, the man did something he hadn't done for 3 days. He felt safe. The bombardment was loud. The mist was thick. The Russian snipers had been silent for days. The man reached into his pocket. He pulled out a silver case. He placed a cigarette between his lips. He struck a match. In the gray gloom of the ruins, that tiny orange flame was as bright as a lighthouse. It illuminated the bridge of his nose, his high cheekbones, and the unmistakable iron cross at his neck. General von Kessler. Nikolai didn't think. He didn't pray. He simply waited for the gap between heartbeats. The general took a long, deep drag. The tip of the cigarette glowed bright red. Now. The world froze. In that millisecond, the sound of the German artillery bombardment faded into a dull hum in Nikolai's ears. He was no longer a man lying in the dirt. He was a machine of trajectory and cold calculation. He exhaled halfway, holding the breath in his lungs to steady his chest. He felt the familiar, smooth resistance of the trigger. Crack. The Mosin-Nagant kicked hard into his shoulder. The muzzle flash was suppressed by the damp air and the ruins, but the sound was sharp, a whip crack that cut through the thunder of the distant shells. Through the scope, Nikolai watched the orange glow of the cigarette. As the bullet arrived, the glow didn't just vanish. It exploded in a spray of white ash and dark crimson. General von Kessler's head snapped back with the kinetic force of the 7.62 millimeters round. He collapsed into the shadows of the ruined kitchen like a puppet with its strings cut. For 2 seconds, there was a stunned silence in the German position. Then the screaming began. The hornet's nest. Sniper! Sniper in the factory! The German soldiers scrambled. They didn't even look for the body. They dived for cover. But Nikolai didn't celebrate. He knew the rule. The shot you take is the last moment you are safe. He didn't look through the scope again. He rolled to his left, sliding out of his narrow burrow and into the crawl space he had dug weeks before. He moved like a snake, dragging the rifle behind him. 5 seconds later, the beehive erupted. The German countersniper Nikolai had spotted earlier didn't hesitate. He fired 3 rounds into the exact hole Nikolai had been using. Brick dust sprayed the air where Nikolai's head had been moments ago. Then came the heavy stuff. Thump, thump, thump. The Germans had brought up a 20 millimeters flak gun. It began to tear the foreman's office apart, the explosive shells turning the brick walls into red powder. Nikolai felt the ceiling of the crawlspace sag. Dust choked his throat, but he didn't cough. He couldn't afford a single sound. The invisible maze. Nikolai reached a collapsed ventilation shaft. He dropped down 6 feet into the darkness of the factory's basement. He knew this labyrinth by heart. He had memorized every pipe, every rusted boiler, and every pile of coal. He moved toward the death zone, a 50-meter stretch of open floor illuminated by the fires of the burning factory. To cross it was to invite 1,000 German eyes. He paused in the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. He took a small tin from his pocket. Inside was not food, but soot mixed with grease. He smeared it over his pale face and the wooden stock of his rifle. He heard boots above him. German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers were entering the building. They were moving fast, their voices sharp with adrenaline. They weren't just looking for a sniper. They were looking for the man who had just killed their general. "Search every floor," a voice barked. He couldn't have gone far. The stalked hunter. Nikolai began to cross the open floor, crawling flat on his belly. He was halfway across when a flare hissed into the sky outside, its brilliant white light pouring through the shattered roof. He froze. He was a dark shape on a gray floor. A German soldier stood on a gantry 30 feet above him. The soldier turned his head, his eyes scanning the basement. Nikolai gripped his combat knife. If the soldier looked down, Nikolai would have to kill him silently, or the hunt would end here. The soldier's gaze passed over Nikolai, then moved on. The soot and the shadows had held. Nikolai reached the other side and slipped into a narrow drainage pipe. The water was waist-deep and clogged with ice and chemical waste. It burned his skin, but he pushed forward. He was moving south, toward the ruins of the tractor plant, where the Soviet 62nd Army held a thin line of trenches. The final stand. He emerged from the pipe an hour later, 2 kilometers from the beehive. He was shivering now, the deep, uncontrollable shiver of hypothermia. His hands were blue. He climbed into the attic of a half-collapsed bakery. From here, he could see the beehive in the distance. It was being hammered by Soviet Katyusha rockets. The sky was a chaotic mess of smoke and fire. Nikolai pulled his notebook from his tunic. With shaking fingers, he wrote,
Target, von Kessler.
Confirmed. 1 shot. 1 kill. He closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold stone. He thought of the wolf hunts in the Urals. He thought of the general's cigarette. He thought of the millions of eyes watching this city. He wasn't home yet. The Germans were closing the ring. He could hear their tanks clanking in the street below. He had 1 clip of ammunition left and no way out. They want the ghost, Nikolai whispered to the empty room. Let them come. The noose tightens. The attic of the bakery was a cold, dying place. Outside, the world was screaming. The clatter of German tank tracks on the frozen rubble sounded like the teeth of a giant chattering in the cold. Nikolai could hear the German infantry, the grenadiers, clearing the basement. He was trapped. His right leg was numb from the frozen drainage water, and a jagged piece of shrapnel from the flak fire had opened a shallow, burning line across his ribs. Through a crack in the roof, he saw them. 3 Panzer IV tanks, their long barrels sniffing the air like predators. Behind them, a squad of soldiers moved with lethal precision. They weren't just searching. They were systematic. They were burning every building they couldn't clear. The duel in the gray. Nikolai looked through his scope one last time. He didn't look at the tanks. He looked at the roof of the beehive, 2 kilometers away. There, nestled in the jagged teeth of a collapsed chimney, he saw it. A faint, rhythmic pulse of light. It wasn't a match this time. It was the sun, momentarily catching a piece of glass. The German countersniper had followed him. You are good, Nikolai whispered, his breath a white plume in the air. But you are still looking for a man. I am already a ghost. Nikolai knew he couldn't win a firefight. He had 5 rounds left. The Germans were 3 floors below him. He did something that would have seemed like suicide to any other soldier. He took his soot-covered rifle and propped it up against a pile of flour sacks, aiming it toward the street. He tied a thin piece of twine from the trigger to a heavy, rusted beam that was slowly sagging under the weight of the snow. Then he crawled toward the back of the attic, where the wall had been blown out, leaving a sheer drop into an alley filled with shadows. The sacrifice. Boom! The lead Panzer fired its main gun. The bakery shuddered. Dust and ancient flour filled the air, turning the room into a white tomb. The German countersniper saw the movement in the attic. He saw the muzzle of the Mosin-Nagant. He saw a shape behind it. He fired. The German's bullets struck the flour sacks, sending a white cloud into the air. At that exact moment, the sagging beam in the bakery finally gave way, pulled the twine. Nikolai's rifle fired into the empty street. To the Germans, it looked like the sniper had taken his last shot and missed. The tank fired again, a high-explosive shell that turned the entire top floor of the bakery into a fireball. The German sniper lowered his rifle, satisfied. He had killed the ghost of the Volga, the return. But Nikolai wasn't in the attic. He had dropped 15 feet into a pile of frozen garbage in the alley just as the first shell hit. The impact had nearly knocked the wind out of him, but the white flour dust from the explosion above acted as a perfect smokescreen. He didn't run. He didn't have the strength. He dragged himself through the ruins, moving toward the sound of a different kind of thunder. From the north, he heard it, the low, soul-shaking roar of hundreds of Soviet Katyusha rockets. It was Operation Uranus. The great encirclement was beginning. The hunters were about to become the prey. Nikolai reached a Soviet trench at dawn. He was white from head to toe, part ash, part flour, part snow. A young private leveled a submachine gun at him.
Halt!
Who goes there? Nikolai didn't have the strength to reach for his notebook. He just held out his hand. In his palm sat the silver cigarette case he had taken from the ruins of the beehive weeks ago, a trophy he'd planned for this moment. The ghost, Nikolai rasped. The legend. The official Soviet records state that Nikolai vanished during the winter of 1942. Some say he died in the bakery. Others say he was sent to a hospital in the rear and never returned to the front. But the German soldiers who survived the pocket of Stalingrad told a different story. They spoke of a man who didn't need bullets. They spoke of a shadow that moved through the white-out blizzards, a spirit that appeared whenever a soldier reached for a light. To this day, in the old veterans' bars in Berlin, there is a superstition. Never light 3 cigarettes from the same match. The first is for the wind, the second is for the cold, and the third is for the ghost. The end.